Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where frontline sales leaders teach you how to build and scale an outbound sales team. Today's video is brought to you by Predictable Revenue's Service LinkedIn Outbound. Find out how we can leverage and grow your existing LinkedIn network to book meetings into your calendar at the link below. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart, and today we are joined by guest number one from the podcast. Maybe he was episode number 2, but he was the one that I recorded the first. So he'll always be number 1 to me. Welcome back to the show, Zach Barney.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it's been quite a while. Close to 4 years since you started this thing?
Yeah, I think we're 170 episodes in, and now I'm sharing the podcast with Sarah Hicks because I've started creating some YouTube content. We're really ramping that up, and I needed some freedom in my calendar to run the company and not just be spending my whole day creating content. But yeah, it's been cool to kind of follow along and get your feedback on episodes, and you really helped set the tone for the shape and direction this podcast took. So from myself, thank you. From the listeners that listen, that enjoy the format, hit up Zach on socials and say, hey man, thanks for the early advice.
Yeah, I take full credit for the success of Predictable Revenue, not just the podcast, but
exactly.
The entire business for Aaron's books. Everything is on me.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Totally fair. Along those lines, we are talking about like the right things that you need to do early when you're building a sales team, whether you're a founder, first-time sales leader. We're going to go through, 5 or 6 of the key pieces with Zach. And there's one thing that you want to stay tuned to the end, because there's one thing that can really screw you over, that is exceptionally painful. That if you just, make a couple correct decisions in the early days, you'll save yourself a ton of stress downstream. But I'm not going to spoil that for you. Zach, why should we start thinking about doing some of this stuff so early?
Well, you kind of just alluded to it. It's expensive if you don't. I work with a lot of startup founders. I've done the startup thing for the bulk of my career, and there's always this tendency to go cheap and to bootstrap. There's a romanticism in hacking your way to the top, which I think is needed. I think it's important to be resilient and not rely on the most expensive toy to get you there early on. Mm-hmm. But there are definitely exceptions. There are things that you should nail early on, or else you will pay for them later on down the road. So, the reason why you and I started talking about this is I'm a huge disciple of Jason Lemkin. I'm sure you are as well. He co-wrote a book with Aaron called From Impossible to Inevitable. And one of my favorite pieces of content that Jason's ever put out talks about the different types of vice presidents of sales, the different stages of VPs and when you need them, right? So, in the early stages from 0 to 1 million in revenue for your startup, you need what he calls an evangelist. And then from 1 to 10, you need somebody that can make it repeatable. And then from 10 to 100 million, the go big VP, the one that can start getting those real enterprise deals. And then lastly, the dashboards leader, the person that, sits behind a computer and tells other people what to tell other people what to do. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's this idea I think people have taken a little bit too far in that 0 to 1 million stage, where they say, okay, I need an evangelist. I need somebody who's that lone wolf persona from the challenger sale that just goes out and finds a way to get it in, doesn't really have a process because there isn't one, because you're a brand new company. That's true. There is not a process when you are a brand new company. However, if you aren't taking the opportunity to figure out what that process should be with those early salespeople, you're missing the mark, and it's going to cost you.
Totally. And because it's not just about if you're a startup, I think the mindset is not just, we are here, we're going to stay in this stage forever, or you're eventually going to need to grow. And whether you're the founder CEO that's handling the sales, you hire somebody else to do that for you, you're going to have to teach somebody how to do it sooner or later.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, 99% of startups that become successful end up raising venture capital. And it's becoming more and more common that a VC is going to want to see some sort of early traction. So there's this huge temptation to just go bring money in, don't worry about anything else. But those same venture capitalists that are telling you to just have some money so that they can validate that you have an idea that people are willing to pay for, are then going to be asking you for your plan. And they're going to be asking for the path to predictability. How do you go from that 1 million to 10 million? How are you going to get there? And if you haven't been utilizing all of the opportunities to track the data that you are gathering from every customer interaction, from every email that you send, then you're starting over. You're starting over from scratch when it comes time to scale that team, and you're setting yourself back in time.
I totally agree on the sales side. And I think from the product management side of things, the 0 to 1 phase is a dicey time. These are times when our grasp on life, on the bank account, is tenuous at best. Life, not in the life or death sense of a human, but in terms of the company.
Yeah.
And so I think getting some of these things set up and documented correctly also are going to provide insightful feedback loops back in the product.
Absolutely. Could not agree more.
And so when we're talking about, we've been talking sort of in the abstract about, some of the things that people need to get done. And, you're alluding to some of them are the systems of record and process, but talk to me, what is that first thing that you think really needs to get nailed?
I would say that you have to have the right CRM set up. Like I've been in a couple of startups where we have transitioned from CRM to CRM multiple times. And when you're an early startup and don't have a lot of money, you tend to be tempted to go with whatever's free out there. There are a lot of really good looking, semi-functional, free CRMs out there. The problem is your sales team is not going to want to use them as you grow. So you're going to ultimately have to migrate, most likely to Salesforce, if not maybe like Microsoft Dynamics or Freshworks or something. And if you haven't been already using the right CRM, that process of migrating all of that data is a pain in the butt. When you are a cash-strapped startup, that money that you saved by not spending $100 a user for 6 to 12 months is going to cost you 10x that, moving all that data back over. So, I'm just thinking of, my days at Outro when you and I first met 5-6 years ago.
Back in the Bubba Page days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when Bubba brought Outro out of Techstars and was using RelateIQ as a CRM, which was ultimately acquired by Salesforce, and is now like their Salesforce Lite version, right? But coming out of Techstars, you also had all of these perks and benefits from different softwares that want your long-term business. And he made the decision to switch from RelateIQ to HubSpot for everything, for our marketing automation, but also for our CRM. Since he was the only one that had any customer-facing interaction for the first 6 months of our business, he had to be the one to migrate all of that data and make sure that it was input properly. So imagine being a startup founder and taking 2 weeks out of your life to move from one CRM to another. When we only had 10 paying customers, it took him 2 weeks to get everything input properly. He couldn't spend his time interviewing potential customers. He couldn't spend his time going out and meeting with the money and finding his next round of funding. He couldn't recruit new talent. He couldn't do any of that because he was focused on data entry, because he was trying to save a buck early on in the days, cost him 2 weeks of his very valuable CEO time.
Yeah. And if you're not or haven't been through the founder CEO journey, 2 weeks is I don't know, modern day, but is like big company or at least established company version of like 3 months. There's so much that happens in 2 weeks that, like, if you think about it, your total lifespan, like the average lifespan of a company like that has got to be 6 to 12 months. And so you're spending a significant fraction of your time migrate. I respect the fact that he cared enough about the data. I probably would have just dropped it. And I imagine that's what a lot of startups do is they say, listen, it's not worth the 2 weeks. I'm just going to lose all that data that's in my other system. And I'm just going to move to Salesforce or whatever system I'm going to.
Yep. And then, yeah, I mean, you're making a conscious decision to lose a bunch of data that your first sales leader that you hire is going to really, really want, right? They're going to want to know, okay, who's our buyer persona? And your answer can't be marketing, right? It can't be marketing. It can't be, and any company that has between 10 and 1,000 employees. That's not a good enough answer for a real sales leader. They're going to want to dive in and get more data. And if you don't have that data to give them, then they are starting from scratch and you're setting them back several months in time while they figure things out and get ramped up.
So you mentioned buyer personas in your eyes, and I have an idea of what sort of the product organization, and hopefully I think in a lot of cases, I think the best case scenario is that product transitions into product marketing and they produce these buyer personas. In the early days, nothing is perfect. It's just you do whatever you can to get out, to get revenue in the door. And so I think it's fair to say that, if you don't have these, it's understandable, but maybe not forgivable. So talk to me about how you how do you see buyer personas and how do you go about building them if you're on the sales side of things?
Yeah, great question. So in the early days, I get what you're saying. Like you don't have a lot of data to go off. So those personas are not going to be incredibly developed, but there are a lot of things that you can gather. You can gather, of everybody that you reach out to and have a conversation with, what are the types of people that respond to you? What's their tenure in their role? What's their seniority level? What's their exact job title? What industry are they in? How big is their team? What software tool stack are they operating on? All of those things you can gather. You might not know what you should be targeting at first, but you can gather that information and track your success rate for each of those pieces of intel so that you can develop your personas later. You might not have this fully fleshed out fake biography that, that HubSpot builds, Marketing Mary or whatever, but this is somebody with 10 years of experience, who's a director level, who's 6 months into their role, trying to make an impact, who has a team of 5. You can find those things out really quick. And again, you don't know if that's your right person, but you can track it so that you will know later.
Because that's I guess the coming back to the importance of that initial system of record. You're going to have some educated guesses, but if you don't have the data to back it up, you're just flying blind unnecessarily.
Yep. So if you'd rather keep flying blind for a longer period of time because you don't want to track it, because you're too concerned about building your product or meeting with investors, that's fine. But it's a calculated risk that you have to take. And don't just ignore the fact that you're missing out on a lot of value.
Fair. So build a buyer persona for me. Let's kind of go through this. Like, what are we talking? Like psychographics, firmographics, that kind of stuff. Like what? Like you said, you're not going to get fully into like the avatars that a huge marketing org like any Series C, Series B stage startup probably is already at. But when you're sort of in that zero to $1 million stage, and I know this is where you have like a lot of experience, because not only have you been through this with 5 companies, that you're also consulting and working with a bunch of other startups sort of on the side, and you're doing this. And so when you're working with them, what does a buyer persona look like? Are we talking pages, 1 page? Is it like, what's on that?
For me in the early stage, it's more a spreadsheet with data of all of their previous conversations, so that we can raise the trends to the top. So what I ask early stage founders to track in their sales conversations is the vertical that the company is in, that they're selling into. Are they an HR tech company? Are they a fintech company? I ask them to document the vertical. I ask them to document the company size. I ask them to document the exact role of the people that they are talking with, and then the seniority level, and then also what messaging resonates with them, so that they can figure out what pains they are feeling later on. ultimately, I want them to be able to say, we're going after companies between 500 and 1,000 employees. They're probably, Series C, maybe Series D stage startups. And we want them to be in fintech, and we're going after director and VP levels. Like, I want them to be able to say with that level of granularity by the time they hit $1 million in revenue, because you still have a huge audience that you can go after, but it's going to be tailored enough to where you can hone in on your messaging and continue to test what emails, what phone calls, what calls to action work. I think you're on mute.
I am. I do that every now and then, just for fun. You mentioned a couple of times, tracking, what they're saying and what's really resonating. Talk to me about why that's important.
Well, you need to know what to repeat, right? I mean, the name of your company is predictable revenue. If you don't know what messaging resonates with somebody, if you don't know, what call to action is getting a response, then you don't know to repeat it or not, right? So I want to know if you're asking somebody if they'd be interested in trying out your software versus are you interested in the demo, I want to know which one is more effective so that you can build marketing content around that, so that you can do more of that and do less of what is not working. So I highly recommend, and this gets into other tools that I would recommend nailing early on, like a sales engagement tool. I would highly recommend writing cadences, writing sequences that have very specific wording and very specific calls to action, so that you can track everything from not just, yes, I'm interested, but open rates, responses, clicks, all of those things. And you can continue to hone in on your messaging, both from a marketing and from an outbound side of things.
Perfect. Because it takes, there's so much to miss, and it's so easy to miss that if you're, if you're in the early days and you're thinking, I'm like putting myself back there, man, like we were using our own CRM system for a while, because that was how we got our start. Was we built this just total piece of junk CRM system that one person bought. Okay. One person. So
hey, you got a customer.
Technically we were a real company, but it was a technicality. And then I think we bounced around with the free stuff, and probably I think we were well before $1 million when we moved to Salesforce, and people were wondering, we were using Pipedrive at the time, which I argue is an amazing tool. And if you plan on staying at 2 reps for the rest of your life, it is the best tool in the world. I would not buy anything else. You can probably get away with it up to 4, but once you get into, and it's not about the user limit of the tool of the CRM system. It's more the time limit that you have as somebody who's managing 4 salespeople, right? Because if you're an early stage sales leader, you're managing 4 salespeople, chances are you're probably doing some other things. And so it comes down to brain space. How much brain space do you have dedicated to working with these people and really truly understanding where they're at? And as you become farther and farther removed from, you have a conversation with Jerry every day and you know everything that's going on in his head, to, well, now there are 3 Jerrys or 4 Jerrys. There's less of that bandwidth between you. And so a system of record like this becomes so much more important, and having these, what's resonating, what's not, having these things captured in a meaningful way so that scales is so much more important, especially if you're the founder and you're bringing in a sales leader, and you need to, pull yourself out of the equation.
I agree. And I would say another huge argument for going with something like Salesforce early on is just their ecosystem. Like, you will not have anybody standing up and telling you that Salesforce is the best looking CRM out there. It is not. Pipedrive looks way better. HubSpot's free CRM looks way better. But Salesforce has done something that very few other companies have been able to do, and that is build an ecosystem around the entire sales and customer facing tech stack that your team is going to want and need as you grow. right? So if like once you get a sales engagement tool, which I would say you need really early on as well, SalesLoft doesn't integrate like super well with Pipedrive or HubSpot or any of the other free things. They're built to be integrated with Salesforce Outreach, same way, right? In fact, Salesforce Ventures just led Outreach's latest round. So you have to recognize that it's beyond just the system of record. It's also the entire tech ecosystem that if you don't have it integrated, you're not going to be able to take full advantage of the value that all of these other tools that your team needs later on have.
Yeah. And let's do some math here. Like say you're going to buy Salesforce from day one, and let's say it's a year early and you buy it you're a solo founder. It's at worst, it's $150 a month. You got to pay up front. So it's $2,000, right?
Yep.
Okay. And so let's look at that. And then every time you want to add another rep, it's $2,000. Okay. So let's say you could have gotten away with something cheaper for 2 years, right? We're talking, if you end the 2 years with say 2 reps, we're talking about here $5,000 to $6,000. And then if you look at what is at the 2-year mark of your startup, what is the cost? Like what's the cost and benefit of, $6,000 versus a couple of weeks of downtime, like in Bubba's case? Like yep. It's a total no-brainer. And you're at a critical time when you need to be learning, you need to have all that data, not to mention the fact that most people aren't going to transition that. I think, Bubba was smart in doing that. I'm pretty sure I would have just let that data die. I know we let some data die in Pipedrive. I actually think I might still be paying for my Pipedrive license because there was stuff in there and I just forgot about it.
Nice. So that money that you would be saving, you're paying in the background.
Yeah. And the long tail, because it's just, in the early days, $20 a month is a ton of money. But yep. when you're making, like when you're doing, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in revenue, $20 a month is hard to find you don't even notice it. Yep. Not that it's not important. It's just, it's a totally different situation. And when we're talking about investments, I feel like one thing that we really, I don't know about cheaped out on, but I think just inherited, because when Aaron and I came together, it was a merger of this moron who tried to build a CRM company and was using Pipedrive, and this guy who is basically, it was like him and one other person and then a marketing consultant. And they were, they had, the coach, they had Aaron, they had the coach that extended Aaron's time, and then they had the marketing person that helped them grow. And so they were using MailChimp. And so the systems that we had, I think maybe we had made the transition to Salesforce at that point, or we were making it. But we had kind of a sloppy marketing automation system in that we had nothing. And MailChimp's a great tool. And if you're just going to be sending, to your newsletter, that's awesome. But I mean, it's taken us, Aaron and I merged in 2014 in October, and it is currently June of 2020. And we are, I think just a couple of months ago, got our marketing automation tool to a point where we're tracking all the right things. And so we've missed out on so much data. And everybody says, oh, you can import and you can export and yada, yada, yada. But there's so many, it's so easy for things to get left behind. And it was all a cost thing. It was like, oh, we didn't want to switch to, autopilot because it's, it was $200 a month instead of $50 a month. And then I look at like the time that we've invested with a consultant to fix all the things in the past. It would have been cheaper to start on autopilot.
Yep. I've worked at a few companies that have switched CRMs multiple times. I've also worked at a few companies that have changed their marketing automation platform. And I would say marketing automation is one of those things where there are a good handful of competitors that are all pretty good. I don't know a ton about autopilot, but I've used HubSpot, I've used Marketo, I've used Pardot. Like there are good tools out there. It's just important to get one and commit to it early. Like that migration is intense. Like both of the companies I've worked at where we've switched from one to another, it's not a couple week thing. It's not a couple month thing. We're talking 6 months to a year of effort, like actual man hours working at migrating things and rebuilding landing pages and losing your SEO ranking. Like all of the other things that cost you so much money because you're trying to save a little bit of money early on and go with a cheaper option.
I just thought I'd throw out that this podcast episode is not sponsored by any of these companies that we're mentioning. These just happen to be the companies that we're using. So we had no ill will to any of the companies that we haven't mentioned yet.
None at all. There are some good tools out there. I just think it's important to commit to one.
Yeah, and marketing automation is certainly one of those ones. There's just a whole lot of things. It's a complex tool, and it's the system of record on the marketing side. And so, like, I don't know. I mean, talk to me a bit about sort of your experience from the sales side, like integrating with marketing and like having seen people go through that switch. What are things that people should be thinking about ahead of time when they're saying, okay, so you say I need to take the plunge on a marketing automation tool earlier than I think, which I think is a kind of a big theme of what we're talking about is, investing a little bit of cash a little bit earlier to save yourself some time downstream. And so when you're looking at a marketing automation tool, what are the core things that it needs to do from your perspective?
Well, I mean, from a sales perspective, it needs to drive leads, right? Like that number one, it has to be effective at helping you ramp up lead volume. Now, a lot of that's on your team to create good content and to actually use the system, but it has to help increase your lead flow. And then secondly, it has to provide you enough data so that you know how to engage, right? Like when you and I first met, I was running teams of SDRs, and I've done a lot of that in addition to managing account executives and other roles. But an inbound SDR, like data that they get from the marketing automation platform as a lead comes in is crucial to making sure that they convert a high number of those into qualified opportunities. They need to know what lead form like got the person engaged, like what they filled out. Did they request a demo or did they just sign up for a pre-recorded webinar? There's a difference in those two things, and their inbound team's response tactics are going to be very, very different based on that. They need to know how often that person has been engaging with your content. Is this the first time they've ever seen you, or have they been toying around and tire kicking for a few months now? You need to know those things so that you can respond properly from a sales perspective.
Totally. And it's got to be, I think one of the common themes that we've seen with predictable revenue is, and I can't attribute this like all just to the marketing automation tool, but I remember people saying, hey, your sales process feels disconnected, right? Like we're having conversations here, we're telling the system one thing here, and then we're jumping on the phone with somebody else there. And we haven't heard that for a little while, a year or two, since we made some like process tweaks. But I remember in the early days, it was like coming through our inbound funnel was like talking to three different people, or like talking to three different companies. It's because everything was so disconnected.
Well, that goes back to why you need Salesforce, right? Because all of the right marketing automation platforms integrate with Salesforce and give you that data. I've run into that before where the data wasn't being written to your CRM. So you don't know what is even being sent to that prospect. You don't even know what they're clicking on because you as a salesperson don't have access to all of the same visibility in Marketo that your marketing team might. So you don't know that your marketing team just engaged with them, just sent them an, when you start outbounding to an old lead. Mm-hmm. If that's not integrated and the systems aren't talking to each other and recording that data, then yeah, it's going to be disconnected and people are going to be really, really confused by that outreach.
Totally. And so if we switch gears, because you're 100% correct, if things aren't connected, if things aren't talking to each other, like they're going to be challenges. And like you said, Salesforce is basically the backbone. One of the core components on the marketing side is the marketing automation platform. On the flip side, it's the sales engagement platform. And now it seems like the tools, like the two tools that come to mind that have raised the most money, SalesLoft and Outreach. It seems like they're driving to be that one spot where you don't even need Salesforce. Right? They've got the opportunity tracking. If you're an early stage startup, what else do you need? Because eventually, the way I think it depends, and I know the data can get messy here, but if all of that stuff is in SalesLoft and Outreach, why even have Salesforce in the first place?
It's a really good question. And I think they might eventually get to that point. But again, we're talking the ecosystem. When it comes to actual sales engagement, yeah, like I don't need my SDRs logging into Salesforce all the time, right? That like everything they do is going to record to Salesforce if they're using Outreach or SalesLoft or Mixmax, whatever, properly. So yeah, they might not need to be in there all the time. However, other people are going to need data, like any sort of customer success software, tracking things like their site usage, however often they're using your application, things like that. All go back to that system of record. I think SalesLoft and Outreach could eventually both get there. I don't think they're there yet right now.
But you're right. And it comes back to the fact that like eventually you're going to push it into Salesforce anyway. So why start with the data elsewhere? We've even had on the Outreach side, we use Outreach internally. We've had issues where you import something into Outreach first, and then you try and sync it back to Salesforce later. And it just creates a nightmare of a data problem. And so
you're right the first time, huh?
Yeah.
That's what you're saying? You're agreeing with me?
I totally agree. Yeah. I think there's an opportunity like if you're staying super lean, like maybe you could start if all you're doing, I think if your plan was to go 0 to 1 million outbound only, I think there's an argument that can be made if you're just a single founder to say, listen, I'm not going to deal with the complexity of setting up SalesLoft and Outreach, Salesforce and Outreach, or SalesLoft and Outreach and Salesforce, your CRM and your sales enablement engagement platform. Because that's a complex thing to get right as a founder, right? Like to get that set up from the get-go, that's going to take you a couple of weeks. And yeah, you can read Outreach's and SalesLoft's documentation. And I'm not saying one isn't better than the other here. I think of the two fairly interchangeably. Sorry, if you're on either side and you're like, oh no, it's different for this reason. They're both doing very, very similar things. I think they're both very solid platforms. In the early days, they both had different strengths, but I think they've both matured into really great companies that have good people behind them and have good software.
Totally agree.
And so we happen to use one. We've used the other. I think honestly, the reason we used Outreach is somebody introduced me to Brian Gerard and to come on the podcast. And he's like, hey, you guys aren't using Outreach? I was like, oh no, we're using, I can't remember what we were using, like Yesware or something. And he's like, let me get you guys hooked up. And so like personal relationship, not in terms of like, we did a big study and we're like, hey, these guys are better than these guys. They're both great. We do work with both companies. But I think if I was a founder in the early days, would I go through the work? At least if I'm making the trip as a solo founder, and I think I'm projecting my experience, and I hung on to sales way too long. I sold as the founder CEO up to $1 million in ARR, which was totally wrong. But I think I was trying to talk myself into the fact that, I'm trying to talk myself into the fact that I would have been smart to stay on Outreach, but then you got to get the leads in somewhere. And then all of a sudden that argument falls apart, right? Because if you're solo, if you're just doing outbound and you know that you're going to just do outbound for the first year, I think you could say, you know what, I'm going to stick with Outreach. But if you're not going in that perfectly straight line, and I think the one thing that we can guarantee about an early founder journey is that you don't know what that line is going to look like, and it's not going to be straight, that you're probably going to need a CRM. Man, I was trying to make a good argument. I thought I had something. I was like, start with Outreach or SalesLoft because they've got most of those features. But when you think through it and all the other things, like if you get a little bit of inbound leads, if you're trying to build your marketing list, like you're just going to need these other things.
Yeah, I think you're trying to talk yourself out of it because there's so much Salesforce functionality that you won't use early on. Mm-hmm. However, you can still get all of the right data in there so that when it comes time to do more marketing, when it comes time to build dashboards and reports, you have the data to actually build it, right?
Yeah.
I've been able to go into a company that hasn't done jack crap in Salesforce when it comes to to data analysis or anything, but because they've been tracking things, because they've been like at a minimum tracking opportunity stages and the titles of the people they're talking to, I've been able to glean some level of data off of that and be a little bit more targeted when my team starts doing their outbound efforts.
And I think that's a really good piece, because I've seen so many times when I'm working with, whether it's a client, whether it's a friend of mine who's like, I have a sales podcast. I'm a founder. I have a bunch of founder friends. So when they have a sales problem, I was like in the co-working space or the accelerator where I started, I was the only salesperson there. And so my friends that also have companies we have a chat when they're like dealing with sales problems. And man, the number of times I've seen people that they were using Salesforce, but they hadn't set it up to track. They didn't have definitions for opportunity stages, or they weren't tracking job titles. It's so common, and it doesn't matter if you have 3 or 4 years worth of usage in Salesforce. Just simply using it, I don't think is good enough. I think there's a minimum bar for data that you need to get in there, and I think that's kind of what you're driving towards. And so I'm curious, what is that minimum bar? What you need to see in the sales system of record in order for it to be useful when they do bring their first sales leader in?
Well, I mean, everything we already talked about with, as granular as you can get with the persona early on, all of their relevant contact information. So their full name, their phone number, a work email address, their social media profiles, all of those things, I think are incredibly important. And I agree with what you just said, nailing down your opportunity stages. I don't care what the names of your stages are. You've got to have defined stages. And what I mean by defined, you have to have a definition around what it means to be in that stage. If you have a stage called commit, you need to say, okay, commit means they have said yes and they have paper in hand, but they haven't signed the deal yet, right? However you define it, stick to it so that as time goes on, what percentage of people that get to the commit stage or that get to the qualified stage, the best case stage, whatever you use, move on and ultimately close. And then you can forecast, right? You can on a high level, you can get into a forecast and know, okay, when my team's walking into the quarter with $3 million of pipeline in the qualified stage, I know this quarter that 500K of it's going to close. So now I'm able to commit 500K from qualified, 600K from the commit stage, and then from my pipeline stage, another 300,000 or whatever, right? Like you need to define what those stages mean and have people stick to it.
I think that's one of the most underappreciated pieces of advice, because if you're not, it comes down to data integrity, right? Like everything we've been talking about this entire episode has been make some early investments, right? And we've mostly been saying make some early investments in software, but it's not software alone that's going to save the day here, right? If you just spend the money in the early days, it doesn't. If you're not using it correctly, you're not going to have the data. And so I love what you're saying there about the sales stages. I think that's absolutely imperative. And also something that I got wrong in the early days. We were making the transition from me to another rep, and I had documented the process. I wrote it out in a Google Doc. I did a bit of training, but she was much more experienced than I was. And so I kind of said, well, I hired somebody who has, 10 years more experience than I do in sales. So why don't I just let her run with things? And I made the mistake of just I was a little bit too hands-off, it was a really funny move. I went from exceptionally hands-on where I was handling the entire pipeline to very, very hands-off. And then when we made the transition from her to somebody else, I was looking at the pipeline and going, well, what does this stage mean? And she's like, oh, it means that. And it was something that was totally different. And so when you're trying to look at comparing my pipeline data versus her pipeline data is useless, because the
two different sets of data.
Yeah. And then when I was looking in the CRM, in the Salesforce fields, they were all empty. And I'm like, well, where is all this stuff? And it was in a Google Doc. And we were taking Google Docs we had a form, like we had a call flow template is what we called it. And it just had all the information about the client, and they were typing, our whole team was typing into these Google Docs and attaching them to Salesforce because that was easier. And I can't claim moral superiority here. I knew about this. I think I helped build the first doc. And then I remember having to fight pretty hard to get rid of it because it was easier, because it's, this is the habit they developed. But now I look back, and that's probably a year and a half's worth of data that was lost. That it doesn't matter if you're using Salesforce if the data isn't going into the right spots, and if you're not collecting those right things.
I'm laughing because it's just a familiar problem that I've seen. I've been a participant in so many times. Like I'm with you there. Like I've been there. I've done that. Big mistake. Those of you listening to the podcast, don't make it.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if it's one of those that you kind of have to feel your way to, right? Like I remember being in like pipeline, like forecast meetings, and, my boss is like, okay, so, where's this deal at? Where's that deal at? And you're talking about the deal, and it's like, okay, so where's this at in the CRM? It's like, oh, it's at this stage. Like, what does that stage mean to you? Oh, it means this. And then you go to the next one, and you're like, and there's something in the same stage that's a totally different spot in terms of like where it actually is. And your system as a sales rep, your system of organization is just broken at that stage. But then from the business perspective, you're missing out on all that data, that information. There's no opportunity to jump in and see a deal that's stalled that maybe somebody higher up can intervene somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So Zach, you've been through this 4 startups, and you're now helping companies do this. I'm curious, can you talk to me a little bit about the impact that you've seen? Like, we've kind of been sort of zooming in and zooming out, but like, if we really had to narrow it down, like, what's the impact of not getting these things right from the get-go?
Time and cost when you have to get it right later, right? Like you mentioned, a $5,000 to $6,000 investment is going to turn into a $50,000 to $100,000 cost later on when you factor in a full-time employee fixing things or an outsourced consultant. The cost of data migration, sometimes you have to pay a professional services fee to do so. So, I mean, it's a big difference. We're talking 7 to 10x difference in cost doing it later than doing it up front.
Mm-hmm. And I'd argue, if you're going to spend the $6,000, you may as well spend an extra 4 on and just find a small, like, I wouldn't buy Salesforce's consulting or Salesforce's like setup jobs, but find somebody who that can advise you on that. Spend a few grand just to make sure you're getting some of these early things right. And you're not just throwing away that $6,000.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Unintentional segue to the cold call. So talk to me about who am I? You're going to cold call me. What is the typical buyer that you're selling to?
Yeah. So I founded a consulting agency a handful of months ago called Zach Barney Ventures, and we consult the types of people that we've been talking about here, early stage startup founders that tend to be more product focused. Maybe, they founded a fintech startup because they're a former CFO of a company and saw an inefficiency in what they did. They know the product, they know the pain, but they've never sold extensively before and don't know where to start to get that early revenue. So that's who I sell to. That's who I help. I've got a handful of really great companies that I'm working with right now that are all in that exact same stage.
Cool. All right, well, let's get to it. Ring, ring. Hey, this is Collin.
Hey, Collin, it's Zach Barney from Zach Barney Ventures. Can I steal a minute of your time?
Yeah, I'm just about to head into a meeting though.
No problem, man. Thanks for taking a second to talk to me. I'm reaching out because I saw your announcement on LinkedIn that you're launching a new startup. So I wanted to take a second, say congrats on that, and understand what made you want to start that company.
We saw generic market gap, and we thought we were uniquely positioned to build on that because of our past experience.
Gotcha. And is this your first startup that you founded?
Yeah.
Wow. Seriously, man, congrats. It's a bold move starting a company in 2020. So you must be really passionate about the problem that you're solving.
Super passionate.
Awesome. Well, I am a consultant for product-minded startup founders like yourself. I've worked with a lot of early stage companies throughout most of my career, and I have seen founders struggle with building their revenue engine so that it becomes repeatable and scalable. They've got this killer product that solves a very real need, solves a pain that they themselves have felt, but they don't quite know how to figure out their buyer and get people to pay money for it. Have you found yourself struggling with that a little bit as you start this company?
We're just we've just locked down our first kind of 25 customers, and it's still me selling. Or we don't really know where we're at because there's just so much going on.
Yeah. If you think about it, Collin, that could be a problem later on, not knowing where you're at. When you have 25 customers, that's a lot of interaction that you can build off of. So what I do is I come in and I help companies like yourself figure out what all of that data means and get yourself set up for scalable success so you can grow from that 25 to 100 customers and beyond. Would you be interested in having a chat with me and determining if a relationship might be beneficial to you?
Yeah, that sounds great, Zach.
Awesome. What does your calendar look like next week?
Nice. Are you what's your calendar look like? So you went next week. Are you like tomorrow or two options kind of guy, or are you just next week if you were actually doing this?
I'm not a two options kind of guy. I read a report from Gong saying that the open-ended, is this of interest to you, and giving them the option tends to work better nowadays. I think there's always going to be some shift, and like something's going to work for a few years and then it's going to change again and again. I always say go with what's natural. The most important thing is getting a hard calendar scheduled. So whether you give them two options, whether you ask them what works. I said next week because we're coming up on the 4th of July today. So yeah. I was playing real life. Normally I try to get no more than 3 days out from when I'm talking.
Totally. So that's and you would pick one time?
I would ask them for a time that works and have them pop up their calendar. If they didn't know, then I would throw out one specific time and nail it down.
Cool. So how's your calendar look? Like, say this is Monday. How's your calendar look on Wednesday?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I've got availability from 2 to 4. Wonderful. Are you cool if I send you a calendar invite for 2:30?
Perfect. Right on, man. I feel like I could just hang out on this podcast chat with you forever, but we got to wrap the episode at some point. So thank you so much for coming back on the show, Zach. This has been awesome.
Yeah, it's been a thrill to join again and hopefully provide a little bit of value to the audience.
Right on. Well, thanks, Zach. And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week. All right. Shout out to Predictable Revenues, Service LinkedIn Outbound, Service for sponsoring this video. As a founder and sales leader myself, I know most of the best practices in terms of like what I need to be doing on LinkedIn. But sometimes I just don't have the time. You know what the right things to do are, but it comes down to a trade-off of where's my time better spent? And can I find somebody to click around on LinkedIn for me and book meetings, and then I can focus on higher level activities. And so think about it. What's the best use of your time? If you're a founder, sales leader, and you have a team, you need some meetings, I'd encourage you to check it out. I'm using it myself. I'm obviously the founder, so eating our own dog food. But if you're curious, click the link below to learn more.